Back to our lecture today. This evening, we turn our attention to a critical yet often overlooked dimension of Palestinian experience: the political mobilization of youth in Lebanon's refugee camps. We will explore how new generation of Palestinians is challenging entrenched power structure, asserting demands for representation, and reshaping the dynamics of political life from within some of the region's most marginalized and precarious spaces. Our keynote speaker today, Dr. Erling Sogge, will guide us through the origin, strategies, and significance of these emerging youth movements, drawing on his extensive fieldwork in camps such as Port Barajne. His talk is based on his acclaimed book, Palestinian National Movement in Lebanon, Political History of the Ain al-Hilwa Camp, published in 2021 and nominated for the 2022 Palestinian Book Awards. Dr. Sogge is a senior lecturer at the University of Oslo's Department of Culture, Religion, Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and holds a PhD in Middle East Studies. Following Dr. Sogge's 30-minute presentation, we will hear a response from Dr. Marie Kortam, who will offer reflections on youth agency, civil society engagement, and the broader implication of these movements for Palestinian political life in exile. Dr. Kortam is a sociologist, a researcher, and policy advisor with a wide-ranging expertise in human rights, conflict transformation, migration studies, and strategic policy making. She currently serves as a research lead for Syrian at War Child, and holds advisory and research roles with the Lebanese Palestinian Dialogue Committee, IFPO Beirut, and Arab Council for Social Sciences, among others. She's also co-founder of the CEDAR Center for Legal Studies in Lebanon, and has previously served as a Lebanon advisor for the Center of Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva. After this talk and comments on it or response, we will conclude with an open Q&A session. So you can feel free to ask your question in either Arabic or English. And yes, now without any further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Sogge to begin his lecture. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me all right? Thanks so much. I want to thank the Ibn Rushd Foundation for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research. Thank you so much, Amany and Cora, for giving me this platform. And thank you also, Marie, for joining me as a commentator in this talk. Marie Kortam is somebody whose research I really look up to. So this is a great opportunity for me. So I'm just going to try and share my PowerPoint presentation here to see if this can... if this is going to work. Let's see. There we go. So I'm going to enter full screen mode and hopefully this is going to work. Can you guys see the full screen now of the presentation? Right. Okay. So after October 7th, 2023, so much brutality has happened in such a short amount of time in the history of both Palestine and Lebanon that it's almost difficult to even remember what the world felt like before this time. And I will begin this talk by going back 10 years in time to a period that in comparison today might seem a little bit more peaceful. Although, as you can see here, it was not perfect. So this is a picture of Lebanon in 2015, which at the time was going through a garbage disposal crisis that triggered widespread protests among Lebanese citizens against the political elite. Hundreds of protesters gathered in downtown Beirut at the time under the banner "You Stink," or in Arabic, "Talat Rihatkun," which literally means your stench has come out. For the protesters, the stench was not only a result of the garbage piling up in the streets, but it was a symptom of the perceived corruption, nepotism, and mismanagement of the political elite in Lebanon. So while the media gleefully announced that the Arab Spring had finally come to Lebanon, a parallel development took place within the Palestinian camps of the country, which also witnessed demonstrations and protests. The Palestinians, however, directed their anger not at the Lebanese state, but against their own political leadership within the camps. In early August 2015, crowds of angry people filled the streets of Burj al-Barajneh, which is the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut. The demonstrations was triggered by the death of a young Palestinian who had been electrocuted to death by a defunct power line. The residents of the camp had long complained about the lack of maintenance of the electrical infrastructure in the camp, but this time they'd had enough, and they proceeded to gather in front of the offices of the Palestinian factions in Burj al-Barajneh, demanding that the leaders would come out and hear them. The people in this camp can no longer remain silent, one of the protesters told a TV camera. Come down to the people and hear them out, because this movement and this people's revolution will continue, he said. If these political authorities are not able to bring the people their rights through their dialogue with the state, go on, resign, leave the camp, because the people will not leave the streets. So what took place in Burj al-Barajneh was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a wave of political activism, primarily organized by Palestinian youth. In the months to follow, demonstrations spread to other refugee camps in Lebanon, while young Palestinians began publishing activist magazines and launched a campaign for democratically elected camp committees. This is our way of saying you stink too, a young Palestinian activist told me. For my part, I was at the time researching my doctoral thesis dealing with the political history of these refugee camps in Lebanon. And the dissertation eventually became a book, which looks like this. So most of the book seeks to understand the Palestinian national movement in Lebanon and the role of these exile leaderships in present-day Palestinian politics. In the final chapter of my book, the focus is not only on the factions, but how these actors are challenged from below by these youthful protest movements. And it covers a wave of protest that erupted in the camps between the years 2015 and 2017. And this is what I will talk about today also. So how should we understand this wave of activism? How did the activists organize themselves? What did they end up achieving in the end? And what does this tell us about Palestinian politics in Lebanon? So some of you might be a little bit disappointed to learn that the protest movements I'm going to talk about are movements that challenge the Palestinian leaderships predominantly, and not so much the Israeli occupation. So let me underline that all of the actors in this talk, from the factions, the younger generations to the older generations, all agree that one should struggle against the occupation. That's central to their existence. They have no disagreement about this. Their disagreement revolves around who gets to take part in the national movement, who should lead it, is there any place for youth, And this is the question that I think is incredibly important, and that has far-reaching implications outside of the camps of Lebanon too. And I will argue that these camps mirror a crisis of a crisis of leadership, let's say, inherent in the present-day Palestinian national movement, and are a part of a much larger struggle for representation for youth. So as refugees are caught up in the day-to-day struggles of surviving in hostile surroundings, it is perhaps easy to assume that their circumstances are hardly conducive to political activity. And this is why so many researchers have turned to the philosopher Giorgio Agamben as a scholar who has had a huge influence in the study of refugee camps in general. So Agamben theorizes that encamped refugees, and by that I mean, refugees who live in camps, are completely subordinate to sovereign power. For example, the state or maybe even humanitarian agencies that operate within the camp. Um, they take part in suspending the legal order while the refugees find themselves living in a permanent state of exception, completely rightless. And because these actors strip the refugees of their political rights and commit only to maintaining their biological existence by maybe providing them food, uh, encamped refugees, Agamben theorizes, are moved from the political sphere to the biological realm. So the refugees are no longer political actors; they're biological beings. And Agamben's ideas continue to be very influential in the study of refugee camps. And although it doesn't necessarily say a lot about the Palestinian camps, other scholars have frequently invoked his theories when discussing the Palestinian camps, referring to them as the refugees living in a state of exception, or the camps themselves constituting spaces of exception, where the political order is suspended. And the notion of camps being spaces of exception has also made an impact outside of academic circles, which you can see in the title of this film that came out a few years back. It says something about the influence of Agamben as a scholar. However, Agamben has also faced criticism, because taken to their logical conclusion, his theories seem to suggest that people who live in refugee camps are incapable of acting as political beings. After all, they can only inhabit biological life. So, in this perspective, in my opinion, feels a little bit off, particularly when we are discussing Palestinian camps, which have a rich history of militancy and political activism. For example, are these people just biological beings? Do they not have political agency? So I don't like to think of camps as spaces of exceptional. I don't think that they were very exceptional. I think that the political life within the camps mirrors political life elsewhere in the region and in the Palestinian world. So rather than being spaces of exception, I argue that these communities, due to their elaborate internal administrations, resembles in a way a Palestinian state in exile. They constitute spaces that are acutely attuned to the Palestinian political landscape, but also to the Arab world more generally, including Lebanon. Um, so before we get to the activists and see how they operate, I think it's worthwhile to say a bit about the history of political life in this camp and how it has developed. That also helps us understand the grievances of the activists. Um, so when most people picture refugee camps, maybe they picture something like this, and this is the Ain al-Helwa camp, the most populous Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon out of 12. And this photo, I think, was taken in 1951, shortly after 100,000 Palestinians had made it to Lebanon, fleeing the ongoing Nakba, the violent creation of the state of Israel, which led to their ethnic cleansing. Um, and Ain al-Helwa is located in South Lebanon, by the way, in the city of Saida or Sidon. But as you can see, the tent landscapes that emerged in the 1950s have over the years been replaced by an urban landscape embodying an aura of permanence. And the campus has crept up to the city and in ways become a part of it. The camp looks like a city in and of itself, as do many of the camps. And there are colorful neighborhoods and sprawling markets, and Ain al-Helwa in particular is referred to by locals as the capital of the Palestinian diaspora, عاصمة الشتات الفلسطيني. And then these are a few photos that I took a couple of years ago when I was there. It is also a camp, like many of the camps in Lebanon, that is heavily guarded by the Lebanese authorities, which says a lot about the refugees' place or maybe lack thereof in Lebanon. So on the third, maybe soon fourth generation in exile, the Palestinians in Lebanon enjoy next to no civil rights, and many deal with these types of security regimes on a daily basis. It should be mentioned that the Lebanese state does not operate within the Palestinian camps, at least until this moment. You know, this is a big discussion which is happening at this time in Beirut, and maybe we can discuss this later. But up until this point, the Palestinian camps are self-governed by a plethora of Palestinian leaderships, factions, armed groups that often compete amongst themselves when it comes to representing the refugees or the control over various neighborhoods and resources. And this arrangement of Palestinian self-governance within the camp is an arrangement that dates back to the late 1960s. So in 1969, Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, signed an agreement with the Lebanese authorities that granted the Palestinian guerrilla movements the right to wage their Palestinian revolution from Lebanese soil. And this provided a unique opportunity for a burgeoning Palestinian national movement to find a base which was close to the homeland and to escalate its armed struggle against Israel across the southern border. And through these accords, the Cairo Accords, as they were called, the PLO also gained complete control of the Palestinian refugee camps, while the Lebanese army retreated. So the camps no longer just constituted impoverished urban slums. You know, they became sites of complex political and military organization, and they still in many ways are. And this sort of events changed how the Palestinian refugees viewed themselves. It's changed their narrative about themselves. Like they were no longer peasants, refugees, or pawns in somebody else's political game. They became revolutionaries, guerrilla fighters, somebody with a cause, something to fight for, right? And these new ideas also transformed camp politics. You know, the factions rallied around the gun and the flag, and everybody willing to hold one could take part. And this paved the way for a more egalitarian, at least to some extent, way of organizing society. Especially the Palestinian leftist groups deemed the passivity, the village mentality, if you will, and the conservative norms of the parent generation counterproductive to the Palestinian revolution. And as anthropologist Julie Petit has shown, this resulted in a situation where young men and young women often could take a leading role in organizing the Palestinian national movement, including the camps. And this was, you know, in the 1960s and in the 70s, but the trend would later be reversed. So the PLO and its allies ended up dragging Lebanon into a 15-year-long civil war. I mean, they were not the only culprits in this, but they played an important part in it. And this was a war in which also Syria and Israel intervened against the Palestinian militias. In 1982, the PLO leadership was forced to evacuate Lebanon. And Palestinian fighters nonetheless started to slip back into the camps of Lebanon as early as 1983, but internal unrest prevailed. And the Fatah movement, which is the biggest movement within the PLO, was rocked by a mutiny leading to many defections. And to maintain political control amidst all of this, the leadership adopted clientelism as a means to rein in an increasingly fragmented national movement. So as the leader of both Fatah and the PLO, Yasser Arafat distributed economic resources, services, and positions to his allies to ensure their loyalty while excluding those who threatened to sidelight him. And at the eve of the Oslo Accords in 1993, and the establishment of a Palestinian authority to take charge of parts of the West Bank and Gaza, the PLO made plans to abandon its infrastructure in Lebanon. It was no longer important. However, it was prevented from fully doing so due to another coup which erupted within the ranks of the Fatah movement. In the Ain al-Helwi camp at the time, a number of high-ranking Fatah officials led a rebellion against Arafat, seizing his compounds and militia functions in the camp, while aligning with Syria and Iran. And for Arafat, this was far from ideal, that Syria and Iran had influence over these camps, including his own Fatah movement, especially as the fate of the Palestinian refugees was going to be negotiated in the final status talks of the Oslo Accords in the late 90s. So due to all of this, Arafat decided to bolster the PLO's military and political institutions in Lebanon. And in 1999, the PLO returns to Lebanon. And the goal, of course, was not to fight Israel, but to contain political dissidents by putting them back on the PLO payrolls. Yet, the PLO was unable to reclaim the camps fully. The events coincided with Hamas announcing its formal presence within the camps for the first time. I mean, they'd been around for a long time, but now they had a formal presence. And from this point on, most of the camps in Lebanon have had two parallel leaderships, one beholden to Fatah and the PLO, and the other to Hamas and its allies. Although this is a bit of a simplification, the reality is far more chaotic. All this to say that the militia groups have continued to govern the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, but not always with a very clear war to fight and without the broad support of the refugees in the present. And in this picture, particularly young men and women find themselves excluded. A young member of the Fatah movement in Lebanon once told me that our leaders remain in their seats until they die. And this wasn't always far from the truth. In the Badawi camp in northern Lebanon, I met a Fatah official who was in charge of the popular committee in the camp, like the internal administration, who claimed that he had remained in that position since the committee was established, likely in 1974. However, his ability to serve the camp community seemed a bit questionable. He was hard of hearing and he had trouble remembering. And during our conversation, he fell asleep many times. And his colleagues had to keep reminding him who I was. And as you can see, his colleagues are significantly younger, but all of them were in their 50s and 60s. So the situation in the Badawi camp was an extreme example of what otherwise seemed to constitute the norm in the Palestinian camps. The once young revolutionaries that had over time become an aging leadership that struggled to keep up with the times, let alone efficiently govern civilian lives. So the demonstrations against the popular committees at the beginning of this talk, they were a reaction to these types of frustrations, right? So I think it's time we met some of the activists that took part in them. And I should say that even though it's very common for camp dwellers to complain about the militia factions in the camps, it's quite rare for these frustrations to lead to any type of organized resistance. So what was so different in 2015 when these protests broke out? I think to understand this development, there are three factors that we need to consider. And the first one being the Syrian refugee crisis. So these activist networks emerged at a time when the Palestinian camps in Lebanon were brimful of new refugees, having fled the war in Syria. So in the fall of 2014, this was a theme that was frequently discussed in an internet forum going by the name of the Palestinian Youth Network. So in this forum, it had been established by a group of friends who were concerned about the situations in the camps. The struggle for material resources had increased significantly, and so were, the social and political tensions that, came with all of this. So these friends, they had little trust that the Palestinian political leadership would find a constructive way to address the crisis, and they took matters into their own hands. We had a feeling that we had to play a role. We needed to carve out our place on the Palestinian political map as Shabab, as youth. Badia told me, and this is Badia, you can see him here. He's one of the activists that I interviewed. So as a journalist at around 30 years old, at the time and a member of Fatah in Burj al Barajna. Badia was a typical participant in the youth network, typical because he had a higher education and he came from, I guess, a middle class family and had a technocratic understanding of camp politics. He insisted that qualifications and relevant experience, not militia military rank, should be a prerequisite for governing these communities. So, although he was a member of Fatah, he was not necessarily a partisan. It was him and his cousins who had led the demonstrations against the popular committee in Burj al Barajna. Badia's criticism of the factions was not rooted in their presence, but in their incompetence, which, in his view, made the camp unsafe. So, pertaining to Badia's colleagues and the youth network, it was difficult for me to trace a specific ideological stance among them. Some supported the Marxist groups, while at least one seemed sympathetic of Hamas, while most of them had no interest in political factions altogether. And they were women and men in their 20s and 30s from all of the camps in Lebanon. Although they were relatively few, they were able to find creative ways to organize and make their voices heard. Which brings us to the second factor, dealing with economic aid. So I think around 2013, an NGO, let's say, involved in a number of development projects for refugees in Lebanon, received a larger grant from a Western embassy to strengthen civil society within the Palestinian camps. And it went on to hire many young Palestinians, some of whom were already connected to the emerging activist networks. So therefore, activists like Badia and others were able to apply for economic support for many initiatives in the camps. And one example of this is the youth magazine Qalam Rasas that you can see here, which was launched in the fall of 2015. And this publication sort of became the mouthpiece for these new activist groups. And it was quite antagonistic against the political leaderships. The activists they launched campaigns for democratically elected popular committees and went into the streets, as you can see here, with graffiti, displaying slogans saying, for example, it is your right to have an elected committee. So events like this would not have been so easy to ignore if they weren't shared widely on social media. I mean, like, sorry, like events like this would have been easy to ignore. I mean, if they weren't shared widely on social media, which brings us to our third and maybe the most important factor. So at the time, it had become normal for people to establish Facebook profiles, for example, representing various neighborhoods in the camps. And these Facebook sites and profiles became important sites for sharing information among activists. And an example of a Facebook group like this was Asimat al-Shattat, literally the capital of the diaspora, which was set up by a dear friend of mine called Mahmoud and some other friends of his. So Mahmoud told me that he had originally established this site to share jokes and Palestinian folklore just between a few friends, but people kept joining the site and the thousands. But the participants, that they would use it for other purposes, because it turned out that people didn't necessarily trust the Palestinian factions to say to tell the truth about what was going on in the camps. So people would flock to sites like this to ask about what was going on. Like, for example, if there had been a gunfire incident in Ain al-Hilwa, for example, people would inquire what's going on here, and they would send messages on the sites like this. And Mahmoud, and his friends would go out into the streets and start reporting, kind of like as journalists. And at its height, the site was actually followed by 150,000 followers. And there were many sites like this, but this was the biggest. And these types of sites became important arenas where people could voice their dissent and criticize the political factions. And this sort of challenged the one-way communication that the factions typically would practice. So all of a sudden, civilians and youth could talk back to the political authorities, would sometimes with a very large audience. And this was a new thing. So the campaigns for elected camp committees didn't really lead to any substantial change. And if you read my book, you can you can see how that plays out. It's a long story. But what I can say here is that the activists often made their impact felt through smaller projects instead of antagonizing, the popular committees and the factional leaderships. Mahmoud here, which is in the front of this picture, from the Asimat al-Shatat site, and other activists from his neighbor in Ain al-Hilba, for example, applied for external funding to renovate the streets of this part of the camp, and walls were painted in yellow, street lights were put up, and a billiard club for youth was also established. And this was only the beginning. Some of the same youth activists and some of the same channels for funding were later instrumental in establishing a Palestinian civil defense in the camps of Lebanon, which today is I guess, a thriving institution with quite a high budget. And of course, like the youth activists, they would celebrate the launch of these types of initiatives. Like, these are not political initiatives in a way; they're not activist initiatives per se, but they celebrated it nonetheless as a victory because it meant that they could get things done without the approval of various faction-based committees who for sure would want to take a piece of the cake, right? So it was a new dynamic, and also for this reason, they were also initially perceived as a threat by the established faction authorities, particularly the PLO, which felt sidelined and would go on to would go to great lengths to discredit the young activists by saying that they were aligned with foreign powers or suspicious actors and so on and so forth. So many of the activists that I interviewed were regularly receiving death threats, like anonymous threats on their lives or their families. And as it turned out, the online campaigns from the camps of Lebanon had also caught the attention of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. In October 2016, the media claimed that President Mahmoud Abbas had made steps to pursue dozens of Palestinian activists who stood accused of targeting the president and the Palestinian leadership. And on the list was my friend Mahmoud, the social media star from Ain al-Hilwa, who they falsely believed to be an agent for, well, one of the political factions. So this was the climate at the time. And with all of this pressure mounting, it became a challenge for the activists to move on. Speaking from his flat nearly 2 years after the initial protests in Burj al-Barajna that started this whole thing, Badia maintained that the activists' biggest achievement in the end was that we got the people talking, as he told me, and he said that any activist will realize that changing the reality around them is tantamount to impossible, but he also knows that once you have got the people talking, once you give them new ideas, there is no turning back. And perhaps it was exactly the scenario that the political authorities feared. So in conclusion, well, why should we care about all of this, at this point in time, when Gaza is reduced to rubble in front of our eyes and life in the West Bank is increasingly becoming unbearable? These internal quarrels in Lebanon seem kind of insignificant in comparison, right? But I don't think that they are necessarily, because the actors that I have described here and that I talk about in my book, they take part in broader ongoing conflicts over representation, over resources, and self-determination that continue to shape the present-day national movement, while the question of Palestinian statehood hangs in the balance. So the political order of these camps are in many ways indicative of where, particularly the PLO and the Fatah movement finds itself at this moment in time, stuck in limbo as guerrilla groups without a war to fight and governing bodies without a state to govern, where every leader controls their own neighborhood. And what the young activists we have met in this talk are asking is, is there a different way that we can organize our struggle, and most of all, can we, with our experience, participate? And this is a question that we'll continue to be asked in the future, naturally. And these young people did not only challenge their own leaderships, they also challenged the way that scholars have tended to conceptualize life in refugee camps. And as I've tried to illustrate here, the refugee camps in Lebanon do not constitute spaces of exception in my mind, where the political order is put on hold, but they are intrinsically tied to a broader political, to broader political currents in the Palestinian, Lebanese, and in the Arab world. And so I think I'll end there and say thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ibn Rushd, for inviting me, and thanks, Erling, for this general overview. And I would say like ethnographic, as you are going deeply inside the stories of the camp and the stories of the young. I will maybe complete your talk and analyzing also and put and emphasize some idea that you highlighted by presenting the Palestinian youth and activism in Lebanon between, and this was absent from your talk, identity, resistance, and dignity. My talk is based, of course, on the talk of my friend Erling, and it's also based on more than 20 years of experience in Palestinian camps and as practitioner and as researcher. So Erling presented the many camps in Lebanon. So in general, in Lebanon, there is 2 recognized refugees camp with many and many not recognized what we call like
Gatherings.
Gatherings. Thank you, Erling.
There are 12 official refugee camps and a lot of gatherings, right?
Yes. Yeah. So all these camps are living a legal exclusion. I will be summarizing the talk and Erling talk and my addition also, political marginalization, of course, and security instability. So the question is how, and this is what Erling tried to answer it. How are Palestinian youth in Lebanon reclaiming agency in the face of protracted exile, collapsing national projects, and rising geopolitical pressures? Right, Erling? This is I think, the main questions.
Of course, yeah.
So concerning, let's start by the crisis of identity in the camps. Youth live in camps. They are living the present, but are prisoners of the past and hostage to the future. The collapse of the Palestinian National Liberation Project has eroded a unifying collective identity. Based on Max Weber theory of legitimacy, there is no more a charismatic or rational authority retains youth obedience. So in response to that, some youth turn to community values, to religion, to resistance narratives, and others face existential identity crisis. So today, youth are trying to craft personal and collective identities amid collapsed political frameworks. This is concerning the first point of my talk, the identity. Now, passing to the two, let's say, two opponent factions, Fatah and Hamas. And the youth are caught in between both factions or with both parties. concerning the factional dynamics, so Fatah is accusing Hamas of using Islamist militia, especially in Ain al-Halwa, to undermine its authorities in the camps. And Hamas, especially post-Yarmouk exile and post-Syria crisis, sees Lebanese camps as strategic ground for political social capital. What is the youth perspective in this dynamics? So many youth feel used as pawns in a broader legitimacy battle. Some are recruited and trained in Syria and before the fall of the regime and in Iran camps. Other remains worry. So that this youth politicization is both spontaneous and orchestrated also between hope and manipulation. Erling described or analyzed the movement youth think in 2015. The second movement inside Palestinian camps and especially in Ain al-Halwa, it started in Ain al-Halwa. It was the movement for dignity, and it was a civil shift in Palestinian dynamics, or political and civilian dynamics. It is because of the Lebanese ministry at that time of labor law sparked this protest in camps because they, as Palestinian refugees, they have to ask for authorization to work, and of course, as Palestinian living and they are and their parents are in Lebanon and they are their birth is in Lebanon, so they have only this residency. So how they should ask for this, and it was a big political conflict inside the Lebanese-Palestinian relation. What changed in this movement? The protests were youth-led, non-partisan, and focused on civil rights and dignity. It marked a break with factional mobilization. No Fatah or Hamas flags, and they were accused also by Fatah and Hamas to not being like or to be funded by embassies and by foreign fund, and they emphasize on citizenship like inclusion. So this was not about Palestine only, it was about being a human in Lebanon for the first time. After many protests, and after this we had also the COVID crisis, and many mobilization happened in Palestinian camps until we arrived to the Operation Al-Aqsa flood on October 7, how this happened in the Palestinian camps. So the response, especially my interest is in the response of youth, because we are talking about youth in this talk. Many participated in social activism or expressed readiness for armed resistance. Hamas also launched what we called Vanguards of Al-Aqsa Flood to recruit youth under a broad and vague program of involvement. But for the first time in years, camps were united emotionally and politically, even if it was very brief. My last point before talking about the risk and opportunities and conclude, it's about the civil versus armed resistant in Palestinian camp. It's a strategic dilemma now, and it's related to the visit of Mahmoud Abbas last week to Lebanon. So the current tensions, or let's say in 2024, was that Hamas pushed for armed recruitment before the Hezbollah also war. And many youth question are the lack of autonomy, the risk of dragging camps into another Nahr al-Barid, like disaster what happened in Nahr al-Barid, the armed conflict between the Lebanese army and outsider armed groups to the camp. So there is three youth positions. The first one is being militant, ready for battle, and the second is pragmatic, especially related, I'm talking about the flood of Al-Aqsa, 7 October. The second is pragmatic, support Gaza but skeptical of local militarization. And third one is critical, want Gaza struggle to remain Palestinian only and strategic. What are the risks or opportunity ahead this, what I just presented? So, Hamas militarization provoked regional and internal conflict. Internal inside Palestinian and inside Lebanese Palestinian, talking about Palestinian youth in Lebanon. And it was, and still until now, especially after the visit of Mahmoud Abbas, a potential return to 80s style armed camps, because we don't want to leave our arms, because we tried this during the Lebanese civil war, and we saw what happened to us as Palestinians. And there is, of course, external forces that they may use camps as geopolitical tools. The opportunities versus the risk are that youth are redefining resistance, and this is very important. The less factional and its more rights-based approach, from martyrdom to memory plus mobilization plus meaning. They are looking for the meaning of everything, and new movements could bridge civil resistance and strategic approach, strategic conflict transformation approach. I will conclude, to not being long, by reimagining the future of the Palestinian youth inside the camps. So the struggle of Palestinian youth in Lebanon is not only for return, it's of course for return, but not only. It's also for dignity, participation, and meaning in the present. Youth are not, and this is what Erling highlighted many times in his talk about the state of exception. They are not passive. They are critical actors. They are actors. And between identity, fragmentation, and new activism lies the potential for political renewal. At the end, support for inclusive spaces, education, and protection is key for the future of this youth Palestinian. Thanks.